I learned the truth in pieces. The way a house learns it is sinking, not all at once, but through small sounds you try to ignore. A crack in the wall, a door that no longer closes right, a floor that slopes just enough to make you dizzy if you stop pretending it's fine. For years I lived inside a home where my voice learned how to disappear, not because I was forbidden to speak, but because every time I did, the air went cold, and I learned silence was cheaper than conflict. People think silence is passive. It isn't. It's an active choice you make over and over, a way of folding yourself smaller so others can stretch out comfortably. I became very good at it. I learned how to read moods before footsteps reached the hallway. I learned which topics turned into storms and which ones passed like clouds. I learned how to smile without showing teeth, how to nod without agreeing, how to swallow words until they dissolved into something like peace. From the outside we looked calm, respectable, a normal family in a normal house. Inside everything was balanced on my quiet. It started slowly, it always does. At first it was just interruptions. I'd begin a sentence and someone else would finish it for me, usually wrong, but with enough confidence that correcting them felt rude. Then it became jokes, light ones, they said. "You're too sensitive," they said when I didn't laugh. After that came decisions made without me. Not big ones at first. Where we'd eat, who we'd visit, what time we'd leave. Each time I told myself it didn't matter. Each time I gave up a little more ground. Silence felt easier than explaining why something hurt, especially when the explanation itself was treated like an inconvenience. Over time, my opinions became optional, then unnecessary, then invisible. The house adapted to this version of me. Conversations flowed around my chair like water around a stone. People spoke over me, across me, past me. I was there, useful, dependable, present, but not heard. I told myself this was adulthood, compromise, maturity. I told myself love didn't need words, that being needed was the same as being valued. I told myself many things to avoid asking the one question that scared me most. What if I stopped being silent and nothing changed? What if the quiet wasn't protecting the peace, but protecting everyone else from accountability? Years passed like that. Quiet years, productive years. On paper, everything worked. Bills were paid, meals were cooked, birthdays were remembered. I held the structure together with routines and restraint. I became the person who smooths things over, who translates tension into politeness, who absorbs discomfort so others don't have to, and people rewarded me for it. They said I was easy to live with, low maintenance, strong. They didn't see the cost because I paid it privately, late at night, staring at ceilings, rehearsing conversations I would never have. Silence became my second language, fluent and automatic. I stopped noticing how often I chose it. The truth is, being silent at home doesn't feel dramatic. It feels practical. You tell yourself you're being considerate. You tell yourself you're avoiding unnecessary fights. You tell yourself that if something really mattered, you'd speak up. But everything matters, eventually. Every swallowed word stacks up. Every ignored feeling leaves a residue. And one day, you realize you've built a life where everyone knows who you are supposed to be, but no one knows who you actually are, because you trained them not to listen. That realization doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives quietly, like a bill slipped under the door, overdue and unavoidable. For me, it came on an ordinary afternoon. No argument, no crisis, just a moment where I was standing in my own kitchen, listening to a conversation about my life that didn't include me, and I realized I had become a guest in my own home. Decisions were being discussed, plans made, assumptions stated, all with the casual certainty that I would adapt, adjust, comply. And I would have too if something in me hadn't finally shifted, not snapped, shifted. A small, dangerous thought formed, clear and calm. They are used to my silence, not entitled to it. That thought didn't make me brave overnight. It didn't turn me loud or confrontational. It did something quieter and more powerful. It made me start paying attention to patterns, to who benefited from my quiet, to how often harmony depended on me being uncomfortable. I noticed how quickly peace was restored when I backed down, and how rarely anyone else had to. I noticed how my silence was praised as patience, while my discomfort was dismissed as overthinking. I noticed that the home ran smoothly because I kept sanding down my own edges, and for the first time, I asked myself why I was the only one bleeding for that smoothness. The truth I learned after years of being silent at home wasn't that I had been oppressed or trapped or unaware. It was that I had participated, not because I was weak, but because I believed love required erasure. I believed belonging meant blending in until there was nothing left to clash. I believed that speaking up would make me difficult, ungrateful, dramatic. Silence felt safer than risking being seen as too much, but safety built on disappearance isn't safety at all. It's a slow vanishing, and once you see that, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to believing quiet is neutral. You start to understand that every silence teaches people how to treat you, and every unspoken truth becomes part of the architecture of your life. That was the moment everything began to change, even though, from the outside, nothing had yet moved. After that day, I didn't suddenly start speaking more. What changed was the way I listened. Silence had trained me to hear everything, and now I used that skill differently. I noticed how often requests were phrased as assumptions, how concern sounded a lot like control when you leaned in close enough, how we usually meant you, and how later almost always meant never. I noticed how my quiet had become a kind of permission slip, one everyone carried in their pocket without thinking about where it came from. The house hadn't grown this way by accident. It had grown around my willingness to adapt. That realization didn't make me angry right away. It made me sad, in a clean, clarifying way, like finally seeing the full outline of something you'd been bumping into in the dark. I started replaying memories, not to punish myself, but to understand the pattern. The times I changed my plans because someone else was tired. The times I apologized for being upset before I'd even explained why. The way my preferences were treated like suggestions instead of needs. None of it had seemed dramatic in isolation. That's how it works. Silence thrives on smallness. It convinces you that each moment is too insignificant to address, until you realize you've spent years living in the margins of your own life. I saw how often I'd been told, gently and with a smile, that I was making a big deal out of nothing. How often I'd believed it. How often I'd adjusted my expectations instead of adjusting the situation. The house itself felt different once I started noticing. Rooms I'd cleaned 1,000 times suddenly felt unfamiliar, like I'd been maintaining a space that wasn't fully mine. I realized how often I moved quietly, not wanting to disturb anyone, even though my presence was supposed to be natural there. I realized how often I waited to be invited into conversations about things that affected me directly. Silence had made me polite to the point of erasure. It had taught me to treat my own life like a shared resource that others could manage. And the strangest part was how normal it all felt. That was the hardest truth to face. Nothing had gone wrong in a way that demanded immediate action. It was all just slowly, consistently wrong. People like to say silence is golden, but they rarely talk about who pays for it. In my home, the cost was always deferred, always absorbed by me. When there was tension, I softened it. When there was conflict, I smoothed it over. When there was discomfort, I carried it quietly so no one else had to. I was praised for being understanding, for being flexible, for being the calm one. Those compliments felt good at first. They made the sacrifice feel worthwhile. But over time, they became a cage made of approval. I realized that as long as I stayed quiet, I was lovable. As long as I didn't disrupt the flow, I belonged. That's a dangerous bargain to make with yourself, because it teaches you to trade authenticity for acceptance without ever questioning who benefits. I began to see how silence had shaped my identity. I wasn't just someone who chose not to speak. I was someone others expected not to. My role had solidified. I was the listener, the supporter, the one who didn't need much. The problem with roles like that is that they don't leave room for growth. They don't allow for change. The moment you try to step outside them, you're met with confusion, resistance, even resentment. I hadn't spoken yet, and already I could feel that pressure, that unspoken warning. Don't upset the balance. But whose balance was it really, and why was it so fragile that my honesty might break it? What surprised me most was how lonely the silence had been, even when the house was full. You can be surrounded by people and still feel unseen. In fact, that's often when it hurts the most. I had convinced myself that being needed was enough, that usefulness could replace intimacy. But intimacy requires risk. It requires letting people see you disagree, struggle, want more. Silence had protected me from rejection, but it had also protected others from knowing me. I had been present in body, absent in voice, and that absence had become normal. The truth was, no one had taken my voice from me. I had set it down, carefully, repeatedly, because I thought that was what love looked like. As these realizations settled in, something else became clear. If silence was something I had learned, it was something I could unlearn. That idea was terrifying and freeing at the same time. Terrifying because it meant responsibility, freeing because it meant possibility. I didn't need permission to exist fully in my own home. I didn't need a dramatic confrontation to begin changing the dynamic. I just needed to stop disappearing. That didn't mean yelling or demanding or flipping the table. It meant choosing in small ways to stay present even when it was uncomfortable. It meant letting silence be a choice again, not a reflex. The truth I learned after years of being silent at home was that quiet isn't neutral. It shapes relationships. It teaches people what to expect from you. And once you see that, you realize the future doesn't change with one big speech. It changes with 1,000 small moments where you decide not to vanish. I wasn't ready to speak yet, not out loud, but inside something had already shifted. The silence was no longer invisible, and that was the beginning of the end of the life I'd been quietly enduring. The first time I broke the pattern, it wasn't planned. It wasn't brave or eloquent. It was clumsy and small, almost unnoticeable, except to me. Someone made a decision that affected my time, assuming I would adjust like I always did. I felt the familiar urge rise up, that instinct to nod, to say it was fine, to rearrange myself. My mouth even started forming the word yes, but something slowed me down. A pause, barely a second long, where I noticed how tired I was of always being the flexible one. So instead of agreeing, I said, "That doesn't work for me." My voice didn't shake, but my hands did. The room went quiet, not because I'd shouted, but because I'd interrupted the script. No one reacted dramatically, no one yelled. That was almost worse. There was confusion, a few seconds of recalibration, like a machine encountering an unexpected input. Someone laughed awkwardly. Someone else asked why. I answered, simply, honestly, without apology. The conversation moved on. On the surface, nothing changed, but inside me, everything did. I had spoken, and the house hadn't collapsed, the peace hadn't shattered, the world hadn't ended. What had ended was the illusion that my silence was the only thing holding everything together. That moment replayed in my mind for days, not because of what I'd said, but because of how it felt afterward. There was fear, yes, but also a strange lightness. I hadn't realized how much energy it took to stay silent until I stopped doing it, even briefly. Silence requires constant vigilance. You have to monitor yourself, edit your reactions, predict outcomes. Speaking, even softly, was simpler. It was honest. That scared me, because honesty removes your cover. You can't hide behind being agreeable if you're actually expressing a need. You risk being seen as difficult, inconvenient, selfish. Those labels had kept me quiet for years. Now they hovered at the edge of my thoughts, less powerful than before. I didn't become outspoken overnight. Change like that doesn't happen in leaps, it happens in inches. Some days I slipped back into old habits without even noticing. Other days I caught myself mid-sentence, choosing different words, choosing myself. Each time I spoke up, even a little, I learned something new about the people I lived with. Some adjusted easily, surprised but accommodating. Others resisted, pushing back with jokes or sighs or subtle reminders of how things had always been. That resistance taught me another truth. Silence had made my compliance feel like a right. When I stopped providing it automatically, it felt like something was being taken away from them. That was hard to sit with. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I didn't want to create tension, but I was starting to understand that avoiding discomfort isn't the same as avoiding harm. The harm had been happening all along, quietly, inside me. I had just been the only one feeling it. When I began to speak, the discomfort shifted outward, shared, visible. That felt unfair to others because they weren't used to carrying it. But fairness isn't about who is most comfortable. It's about who has been silent the longest. I also learned that not every truth needs an audience. Speaking up didn't mean explaining myself endlessly or justifying every feeling. Sometimes it meant saying no without a story. Sometimes it meant letting someone be disappointed. That was one of the hardest lessons. I had built my silence on the belief that other people's comfort was my responsibility. Letting go of that belief felt like stepping onto unstable ground, but each time I did, the ground held. People adjusted, the house adapted, the world was more resilient than I'd given it credit for. There were moments of backlash, subtle ones mostly, comments about how I'd changed, jokes about me finding my voice, questions framed like concerns. Are you okay? You seem different. I was different. That was the point. But those reactions tested me. They made me wonder if silence had been easier, if speaking was worth the friction. In those moments, I had to remind myself why I'd started, not to win arguments, not to assert dominance, but to exist fully, honestly, in the place I called home. What surprised me was how my own perception of myself began to shift. I stopped seeing myself as the calm one, the easy one, the one who didn't need much. I started seeing myself as someone with preferences, limits, opinions that mattered simply because they were mine. That shift didn't just change how I spoke, it changed how I listened. I listened to myself more closely. I noticed when something felt wrong instead of brushing it off. I trusted my reactions instead of immediately questioning them. Silence had taught me to doubt myself. Speaking, even quietly, taught me to trust again. The truth I learned after years of being silent at home was that your voice doesn't come back all at once. It returns in fragments, in half-sentences, in moments of courage that feel almost invisible. But each fragment matters. Each one rebuilds a part of you that went dormant, and as those parts wake up, you realize something else. The home you thought you were protecting with your silence was never as fragile as you believed. What was fragile was you, stretched thin by years of not being heard, and once you begin to speak, even imperfectly, that fragility starts to heal. As my voice returned in small, uneven ways, I began to understand how deeply silence had shaped the rhythm of my days. It wasn't just about conversations, it was about how I moved through time. I had learned to wait, to pause before reacting, to give everyone else the first draft of every moment. Speaking up disrupted that rhythm, and disruption has consequences. Plans took longer, decisions required actual discussion, emotions surfaced that had been buried under politeness. The house grew louder, not in volume, but in honesty. That honesty was uncomfortable, especially for those who had benefited from the quiet version of me. But discomfort, I was learning, wasn't a signal to stop. It was a signal that something real was happening. There were days I missed the old ease. Silence had been predictable. It had a script. Speak too much and you risk conflict. Speak too little and you disappear. I had mastered the second option. Now I was navigating something messier, something without clear rules. I didn't always get it right. Sometimes I over-explained, trying to soften the impact of my words. Sometimes I retreated again when faced with resistance. Progress wasn't linear, it looped and doubled back on itself. But even on the days I slipped, I noticed a difference. I was aware of the choice. Silence was no longer automatic. It was something I opted into, consciously, when it served me, not when it erased me. The reactions around me continued to teach me. Some people adapted quickly, recalibrating their expectations, meeting me where I was. Others clung to the old dynamic, pushing against the change with subtle pressure. They weren't villains, they were human, adjusting to a shift they hadn't asked for, but their discomfort was not a reason for me to retreat. That was another truth I had to learn. Growth often feels like loss to the people who liked you smaller. That doesn't make the growth wrong, it makes it necessary. I also began to see how silence had affected my sense of worth. When you don't speak, you start to believe you don't have much to say. When you don't assert needs, you start to believe you don't have many. I had spent years minimizing myself, and that habit didn't vanish overnight. Even as I spoke more, a voice inside me questioned whether I was being selfish, whether I was asking for too much. Each time, I had to answer that voice with evidence. The evidence was simple. The world did not fall apart when I expressed myself. Relationships didn't end. The house still stood. In some ways, it became sturdier, built on something more solid than unspoken agreements. One of the most unexpected changes was how I began to experience solitude. Before, being alone felt like the only place I could fully exist. Silence at home had pushed me inward, making my inner world richer but also heavier. Now, as I spoke more, solitude felt different. It was no longer an escape, it was a choice. I wasn't retreating to recover from being unseen. I was resting. That distinction mattered. It meant I wasn't living two separate lives anymore, one public and one private. I was slowly integrating them, letting my inner voice have a place in the shared space of the home. I learned too that speaking up doesn't guarantee being understood. Sometimes my words landed wrong. Sometimes they were misinterpreted or dismissed. That was frustrating, but it was also real. Silence had promised safety but delivered isolation. Speaking promised connection but required resilience. I had to accept that not every truth would be met with agreement, and that was okay. My goal wasn't to control how others responded. It was to stop betraying myself for the sake of ease. There was grief in this process, a quiet mourning for the years I'd spent folded into myself. I wondered who I might have been if I'd learned earlier that my voice mattered. But grief, I discovered, doesn't mean regret has to paralyze you. It can clarify. It can sharpen your sense of what you're no longer willing to lose. I couldn't get those years back, but I could honor them by refusing to waste the ones ahead. The truth I learned after years of being silent at home was that silence doesn't just hide pain, it hides possibility. When you stop speaking, you stop shaping your life. Others do it for you, not out of malice, but out of habit. Reclaiming your voice doesn't mean becoming someone else. It means returning to who you were before you learned that quiet was the price of belonging. And once that return begins, it doesn't end. It becomes a practice, a daily decision to show up as yourself, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's messy, even when it would be easier to disappear. By the time my voice felt less foreign in my own mouth, I began noticing changes that had nothing to do with anyone else. My body responded first. The tightness I'd carried in my shoulders for years eased in small increments. I slept more deeply. I breathed more fully. Silence had lived in my muscles as much as in my words, and speaking began to release it. I hadn't realized how much tension came from constantly scanning the environment, anticipating reactions, preparing to shrink. When I stopped doing that as often, my body followed suit, learning a new language of ease. It wasn't dramatic, but it was consistent, and consistency is how real change takes root. I also noticed how my thoughts shifted. Silence had trained my mind to run ahead of conversations, editing and censoring before anything left my mouth. Now I let thoughts exist without immediately judging them. Some were clumsy, some were sharp, some surprised me. Allowing them space didn't mean I spoke everyone aloud. It meant I trusted myself to choose. That trust was new. For years I'd treated my inner voice like a liability, something to manage carefully so it wouldn't cause problems. Now I began to see it as a resource. It carried information about my needs, my limits, my values. Ignoring it had been costly. The home itself continued to adjust. Not smoothly, not all at once, but steadily. New patterns formed. Conversations included pauses where my input was expected rather than assumed away. Decisions took longer, but they felt more honest. There was friction, yes, but also clarity. I realized how often the old peace had been built on ambiguity. No one knew where I stood because I rarely said it. Now they did, and that knowledge changed the dynamic. Some days were awkward, some days were easier than I'd imagined. Both were part of the process. What I hadn't anticipated was how my change would reflect things back to others. When one person stops being silent, it forces everyone else to hear themselves more clearly. Patterns that had been invisible became obvious. Assumptions had to be examined. Not everyone liked that. Some responded with defensiveness, others with introspection. I learned to let those reactions be theirs. Silence had taught me to manage other people's feelings. Speaking taught me to respect them without taking responsibility for them. There were moments of doubt, moments when I wondered if I was overcorrecting, if I was becoming someone I wouldn't recognize. Those fears were echoes of the old conditioning. I had been taught that self-expression was dangerous, that it risked rejection. Each time doubt surfaced, I returned to evidence. I looked at how I felt in my body. I looked at the quality of my relationships. I looked at whether I recognized myself in my own life. The answers were clearer than I expected. I also began to understand that silence had limited my imagination. When you don't speak, you don't fully envision alternatives. You accept what is, because imagining what could be feels pointless if you don't believe you can ask for it. As my voice returned, so did my sense of possibility. I considered changes I'd never allowed myself to want. Different routines, different uses of my time, different futures. Speaking up wasn't just about correcting the present, it was about opening doors I'd kept closed by default. The truth about silence is that it's contagious. It spreads inward and outward. It shapes how you see yourself and how others see you. Breaking it requires patience, not force. I learned to choose my moments, to speak with intention rather than urgency. Not every battle needed to be fought. Not every thought needed to be voiced. The difference now was that I chose rather than defaulting to disappearance. That choice was the real power. One evening, I caught myself laughing in the kitchen, alone, at the sound of my own voice recounting a story out loud. It startled me. I hadn't realized how often I'd kept my voice low, even when no one else was around. Silence had followed me everywhere. Letting go of it felt like reclaiming a part of myself I'd misplaced years ago. It was a quiet joy, not flashy or loud, but deeply grounding. The truth I learned after years of being silent at home was that your voice isn't just for conflict or correction. It's for connection. It's for shaping the texture of your days. It's for reminding yourself that you are here, that you take up space, that your presence matters. Silence had taught me endurance. Speaking was teaching me life, and that lesson, once learned, couldn't be unlearned. It followed me into every room, every conversation, every decision, changing not just how I spoke, but how I lived. The shift didn't happen all at once, and it certainly wasn't perfect. There were mornings when I woke with a heaviness, remembering the old habits my body and mind had memorized. I would catch myself holding my tongue in ways that had become automatic, pausing too long, softening my words, downplaying my feelings. Old habits die slowly, especially the ones that were survival mechanisms. But each time I noticed, I corrected, I nudged myself to speak the truth, even if only in small doses. A simple, I feel differently or I need a moment became tiny revolutions, each reinforcing that my voice mattered and that I could use it without catastrophic consequences. I also noticed how speaking changed the way I experienced time. Silence had a peculiar effect. It made days feel like extensions of one another, a grey, flattened continuum. Once I began articulating thoughts, expressing needs, and asking questions, moments gained shape and weight. Conversations became landmarks, decisions became events. The mundane was suddenly visible. Even chores and routines had texture when discussed aloud or negotiated with others. My life didn't just happen, it unfolded. I could see the flow of cause and effect, of intention and reaction, in a way I hadn't before. Another revelation was how speaking up affected relationships beyond my immediate family. Friends noticed subtle changes, even if I didn't announce them. They commented on my tone, my energy, my willingness to participate in planning or decision-making. Some were pleasantly surprised, some, perhaps, uncomfortable. It was fascinating to watch dynamics shift. People treat silence like a vacuum. When it's filled, everything moves. Conversations had more reciprocity, laughter had more resonance, and even disagreements felt different. Not easier necessarily, but real. That sense of reality, of being fully present and engaged, was something I hadn't realized I was missing. Yet, speaking up came with responsibility. The freedom of my voice meant I had to learn how to wield it wisely. Words could clarify, inspire, or heal, but they could also wound, mislead, or escalate. I studied tone, timing, and context without turning into a constant self-editor. It wasn't about perfection, it was about awareness. I became mindful of pauses, of body language, of when my words served understanding versus when they served ego. This mindfulness deepened my confidence because I could see cause and effect. I spoke, observed the impact, and adjusted. I had control without rigidity, freedom without chaos. There were moments of friction, moments when my voice collided with entrenched patterns in the household. Some people resisted changes subtly, interruptions, dismissive gestures, sighs, but I had learned to recognize these not as failures, but as data. Silence had been invisible, my voice was visible, reactions were reactions to visibility. I learned patience, observation, and selective engagement. I realized that power didn't lie in convincing everyone to accept my voice, but in consistently asserting it. The ripples were slower than I wished, but they were undeniable. Self-reflection became more vivid. I journaled more, not just privately but aloud, speaking thoughts into the air to hear their cadence and weight. This helped me detect underlying patterns in my thinking and in my relationships. What had been internalized, fear, doubt, people-pleasing, emerged for inspection. Speaking gave me leverage over my inner world. Thoughts stopped being mere mental noise and became navigable terrain. I learned the difference between intuition and anxiety, between observation and projection. My inner silence had hidden these distinctions. My voice revealed them. Another unexpected truth emerged. Vulnerability wasn't a liability, it was connective. Early on, I hesitated to admit confusion, hurt, or uncertainty. Over time, sharing small truths drew empathy instead of criticism. People responded to authenticity. They mirrored it back. Silence had been armor. Words, when chosen thoughtfully, were bridges. The act of being heard became as important as being understood. In moments of tension, simply speaking what I felt, even without resolution, diffused energy. Silence had taught me to survive. Speech was teaching me to coexist. I noticed my own biases and blind spots in new ways. Speaking forced me to articulate assumptions, preferences, and reactions. When voiced, I could interrogate them. I realized how often I had accepted defaults because I hadn't questioned the status quo. Each spoken objection or suggestion became a small act of recalibration. The household, the routines, the culture of home itself began to shift in response. Not drastically, not overnight, but incrementally, like tectonic plates adjusting slowly beneath the surface. Change was quiet but undeniable. Finally, I understood that reclaiming my voice was an act of self-validation. Every time I spoke up, I affirmed that I deserved space, attention, and respect, not as a favor, but as a baseline. Silence had implied that my needs were negotiable or secondary. Voice said otherwise. Over time, this affirmation rippled outward. It affected my posture, my tone, my willingness to take on challenges outside the home, my capacity to engage in the world fully. Speaking at home became training for speaking everywhere. I had learned that the most profound truth of all was that my presence, expressed through voice, was intrinsically valuable. The act of speaking my truth began to intersect with my sense of identity in ways I hadn't anticipated. For years, I had defined myself in relation to the household, its moods, expectations, and routines. My thoughts, opinions, and feelings were filtered through a constant, silent negotiation. But as I began to voice even the smallest preferences, a new internal framework emerged. I was not merely a participant in someone else's world, I was an agent in my own. This realization was both exhilarating and daunting. Suddenly, choices carried weight. and with weight came responsibility. I couldn't retreat behind silence anymore. If I wanted influence or respect, I needed to cultivate clarity, confidence, and consistency in expression. This shift brought with it a series of confrontations, though not always dramatic. Conversations that would once have been perfunctory or avoided entirely now required nuance and courage. I had to learn the delicate balance between assertiveness and diplomacy. I discovered that saying no was not inherently selfish. It was a declaration of limits, a way to preserve energy, focus, and integrity. Conversely, saying yes with awareness became meaningful, not automatic. Each verbal decision became an experiment in self-trust. There were moments of misstep, of hesitation, of over-explaining, but each offered lessons. Over time, I began to notice a pattern. The more I engaged authentically, the more my environment adjusted to my presence rather than against it. I also observed a shift in perception, both others' perception of me and my perception of myself. People who had once assumed I would remain silent began to treat me differently. Their responses ranged from curiosity to mild irritation, but always with recognition that I had changed. I noticed colleagues, friends, and family members pausing, listening, and occasionally deferring to my perspective in ways they hadn't before. My inner dialogue mirrored this change. For the first time, I stopped questioning whether my contributions were valid. I began acknowledging that my perspective had weight, my experiences had lessons, and my voice deserved space. It was a kind of cognitive liberation, one I hadn't anticipated when I first resolved to speak up. I found that communication was also a mirror. The act of articulating thoughts highlighted gaps in understanding, both in myself and in others. Miscommunications became opportunities to clarify, not opportunities to retreat. I learned to ask questions as much as I offered answers. Curiosity became a tool, both for deepening connection and for self-reflection. Listening became as important as speaking because it illuminated the ways in which my words landed and how I could adjust tone, emphasis, and timing. The household, once a realm of passive interaction, became a dynamic laboratory for observation, experimentation, and growth. Every conversation became data, every response a clue, every pause a test. The emotional spectrum of daily life widened as a result. Previously, I had masked feelings, glossed over discomfort, or diluted enthusiasm to maintain neutrality. Speaking invited full emotional engagement. Joy became louder, frustration sharper, curiosity deeper. This recalibration was initially disorienting. I had grown accustomed to emotional moderation, almost as a survival tactic, but over time, the depth and range of feelings became energizing rather than exhausting. Expressing emotion responsibly through words, tone, and timing enhanced intimacy, empathy, and connection. Life felt more vibrant, richer in texture, and layered in a way that silence had never allowed. There were moments when resistance from others was palpable. Not everyone welcomed my newfound assertiveness. Some family members tested boundaries, hoping silence would return. Arguments flared, subtle power plays emerged, and old patterns tried to reassert themselves. But having cultivated both patience and voice, I navigated these instances with awareness rather than reflexive retreat. I learned to speak clearly, state needs directly, and accept that I could not control every reaction. Resistance became a measure of progress, proof that my presence was noticed and that change, though uncomfortable, was real. I began noticing patterns in my own growth. Speaking up revealed blind spots in thought and behavior, yet it also illuminated strengths I had long ignored. I discovered resilience, creativity in problem solving, and the capacity for empathy under pressure. Silence had sheltered me from mistakes, but it had also limited opportunity for insight. Voice created a feedback loop: action, observation, reflection, adjustment. Growth accelerated. Mistakes were no longer indicators of failure, but signals of active engagement. Confidence was no longer an abstract goal, it was a skill honed through consistent practice. An unexpected benefit was the cultivation of accountability. With voice came responsibility not just to express, but to follow through. Promises, commitments, and expectations became explicit rather than assumed. I found that my reliability in these small daily interactions compounded, reinforcing both self-respect and the respect of others. The household ecosystem began to operate with more clarity, less guesswork, and fewer misunderstandings. The quiet dynamics of power and expectation had shifted in subtle but significant ways. I wasn't merely surviving in my environment, I was participating fully and shaping it. Ultimately, this journey of voice intertwined with self-compassion. Speaking up forced me to confront fear, insecurity, and ingrained self-doubt, but it also taught patience and acceptance. I celebrated small victories, a clearly stated opinion, a calmly delivered no, an emotion articulated without apology. I learned to treat my voice as a living instrument, capable of nuance, strength, and beauty, but also requiring care and practice. By the end of this process, I understood something profound. Silence had been a shield, necessary at one stage, but voice was a lifeline, a conduit for growth, connection, and authenticity. I had not just learned to speak, I had learned to live. The transformation that speaking my truth sparked was not linear, nor was it free from setbacks. Each day brought new challenges, moments where old habits of silence resurfaced like shadows in familiar corners. But by now I had developed a framework for understanding these moments, not as failures, but as signals that something deeper within me needed attention. I noticed that certain triggers, long dormant, still provoked hesitation, criticism, tension, or even passive resistance from others could tempt me back into old patterns. Yet instead of automatically retreating, I learned to pause, breathe, and analyze. Why am I withdrawing? What am I avoiding? Who am I afraid of upsetting? And why? This reflective pause became a tool for self-mastery, turning vulnerability into clarity. Part of this process involved redefining conflict. Previously, I equated silence with peace and confrontation with disruption. I feared that speaking up would always escalate tension, but experience taught me otherwise. Conflict, when approached consciously, could be constructive. It revealed hidden assumptions, exposed miscommunications, and offered opportunities for mutual understanding. I learned to distinguish between destructive arguments, rooted in ego and avoidance, and productive dialogue, rooted in honesty and curiosity. By framing conversations in terms of problem-solving rather than winning, I discovered that relationships could grow stronger even amid disagreement. The household, once a place of suppressed emotions, became a space where negotiation, compromise, and honesty were possible. I also became attuned to subtler forms of communication, tone, body language, and timing. Words alone were powerful, but the way they were delivered shaped perception, receptivity, and impact. I practiced modulating voice, pacing speech, and observing reactions. Listening became not just passive hearing, but active engagement. I noticed shifts in others' responses as I refined these skills. A family member who had initially dismissed me now paused, reflected, and responded thoughtfully. A peer who had interrupted me out of habit began to allow space for contribution. These micro-adjustments reinforce the principle that communication is relational. It is as much about receiving as it is about expressing. My presence started to carry weight without confrontation, simply because I had learned to inhabit it fully. Another revelation was the importance of narrative. Silence had kept my story fragmented and incomplete, told only in fleeting gestures or unspoken signals. Speaking allowed me to weave coherence, articulate values, and contextualize experiences. I noticed that when I framed events with intention, highlighting lessons learned, expressing emotions authentically, and connecting past with present, others responded differently. They began to understand me in a fuller sense, not just the person who reacted to circumstances, but the person who reflected, processed, and grew from them. Storytelling became a bridge, allowing me to connect on a deeper level while also solidifying my own sense of identity. Equally important was learning to navigate judgment, both internal and external. Old voices, echoes of past conditioning, whispered doubts and self-criticism. They questioned whether my words mattered, whether my opinions were valid, or whether I might be perceived as overstepping. Simultaneously, external judgment emerged in subtle forms: skeptical looks, passive resistance, or occasional dismissiveness. The challenge was not to eliminate judgment, that is impossible, but to build resilience. I cultivated discernment, learning when feedback was constructive and when it was noise. I practiced self-compassion, reminding myself that growth invites scrutiny and that my voice was inherently valuable, regardless of reaction. With this practice, my relationships began to deepen in ways I hadn't anticipated. People responded to authenticity with authenticity, conversations became reciprocal, trust strengthened, and bonds became layered with mutual respect. Silence had kept interactions superficial, filtered through politeness or avoidance. Voice introduced texture, nuance, and intimacy. I began to notice subtleties: a sibling confiding more freely, a parent seeking my advice, a friend turning to me in uncertainty. These shifts were not magical, but cumulative, the product of consistent presence, clarity, and vulnerability. The household dynamic, once rigid and predictable, evolved into a more flexible, responsive, and emotionally rich environment. I also realized the cumulative impact of small victories. A clear request, a calmly stated boundary, or a thoughtfully expressed concern. Each moment was a thread in a larger tapestry of change. Over time, these threads wove a pattern of empowerment, reinforcing both my identity and my relationships. Speaking up was no longer a single act, but a habitual practice, a lifestyle of engagement rather than avoidance. I observed a feedback loop. Authentic expression increased confidence, which increased clarity, which deepened relationships, which reinforced confidence. The loop created momentum, a steady forward motion that carried me through periods of doubt or discomfort. Interestingly, this journey illuminated the broader question of influence. Silence had limited my participation to the margins. Voice expanded it. I realized that influence was not about control, but about presence, insight, and clarity. By articulating needs, sharing perspectives, and engaging thoughtfully, I shaped outcomes and dynamics without coercion. Influence became a byproduct of authenticity rather than a goal in itself. This subtle shift reduced anxiety about how others would respond. The focus moved from seeking approval to expressing truth. It was a liberating change, one that aligned intention with action and diminished fear of judgment. Finally, I recognized that this process of voice was ongoing. There was no final destination where silence became obsolete or confidence became absolute. Life would continue to present situations that tested courage, patience, and skill. But having built a foundation of reflection, resilience, and authenticity, I approached these challenges differently. I no longer feared the discomfort of expression. I welcomed it as a sign of engagement, growth, and presence. Speaking my truth had transformed not just how others perceived me, but how I perceived myself. I had moved from survival to participation, from reaction to agency, from silence to power. The final realization came gradually, almost imperceptibly, like sunlight creeping through the blinds at dawn. I noticed it first in moments of stillness, the absence of tension that had previously accompanied every conversation, the sense of alignment between thought and speech, the quiet confidence that grew from consistency. Speaking my truth had become less about asserting myself in reaction to others and more about honoring the integrity of my own experience. This shift affected not only how I related to people but also how I related to life itself. Every interaction carried the potential for learning. Every disagreement became a path to understanding. Every expression a reinforcement of self-respect. In this phase, I embraced the paradox of vulnerability. The more openly I expressed myself, the more resilient I became. Vulnerability, once a threat, turned into strength, a conduit for connection and insight. I learned that fear of exposure is often rooted in anticipation, not reality. In practice, most reactions were far less dramatic than I had imagined. People may disagree, they may challenge me, or they may even reject a perspective, but those responses rarely defined my worth or diminished my voice. This understanding liberated me from the mental scripts of silence I had carried for years, enabling me to engage fully without hesitation, performatively or apologetically. Equally important was recognizing the ripple effect of voice. Speaking up did not exist in isolation. It influenced the atmosphere around me, subtly altering dynamics. Conversations that once ended in frustration now concluded with clarity. Tensions that had lingered unspoken dissolved through dialogue. Family members and peers began to mirror the openness I practiced, gradually shifting the culture of interaction. I realized that breaking silence was not merely personal, it was communal. By honoring my own truth, I inadvertently encouraged others to honor theirs, creating a cascade of honesty and authenticity that expanded beyond myself. Another layer of growth emerged in the realm of decision-making. Silence often equated to passivity, leaving important choices guided by inertia or the preferences of others. Once I embraced voice, I engaged proactively with decisions large and small. I discovered the empowerment inherent in expressing preference, weighing options aloud, and negotiating outcomes transparently. This not only shaped external circumstances, but deepened self-awareness. Each choice articulated clarified values, revealed priorities, and reinforced autonomy. I became an active participant in life rather than a passive observer, a transition that required courage but yielded profound satisfaction. I also learned to integrate reflection with action. Speaking my truth is not just a momentary act, it is an ongoing dialogue between experience and interpretation. I adopted practices to reinforce this: journaling, reflective conversations, and mindful pauses before responses. These tools ensured that my expressions were deliberate, aligned with intention, and resilient to emotional turbulence. Over time, the habit of conscious expression created a feedback loop. Reflection sharpened insight, insight informed action, action reinforced clarity. The result was a steady rhythm of growth, each iteration building confidence, skill, and presence. This journey illuminated the nuanced role of empathy. Speaking honestly does not negate compassion. In fact, it enhances it. I discovered that empathy is most effective when it coexists with clarity, when I communicate needs and perspectives while genuinely considering the experiences of others. This dual approach transformed conflicts into conversations, criticism into constructive dialogue, and tension into mutual problem-solving. Relationships became richer, not because everyone agreed with me, but because authenticity fostered trust, predictability, and emotional safety. I had learned that speaking my truth need not compromise kindness or care. In fact, it strengthened them. One of the most profound lessons was that the journey of voice is deeply personal, yet universally resonant. While the specifics of my household, experiences, and relationships are unique, the underlying principles, courage, reflection, resilience, empathy, and consistency, apply broadly. Silence often stems from fear, conditioning, or self-doubt, and its consequences ripple through connections and identity. Choosing to speak requires deliberate effort, patience, and practice, but the rewards, clarity, connection, agency, and empowerment are transformative. The lesson is not theoretical, it is lived moment by moment, word by word, interaction by interaction. As I look back, I recognize that silence was not merely an obstacle, it was also a teacher. It revealed patterns, illuminated fears, and highlighted the value of authentic expression. It set the stage for a deeper understanding of self and others. By confronting silence with courage, I not only reclaimed my voice, but reshaped my relationships, my decisions, and my life trajectory. Every hesitation, every small triumph, every deliberate word contributed to a tapestry of growth that continues to expand. Speaking truthfully, consistently, and thoughtfully became both the lens and the vehicle through which I navigate the world. Ultimately, the truth I learned after years of being silent at home is deceptively simple yet profoundly impactful. Your voice matters, not as a tool of dominance or manipulation, but as an instrument of clarity, presence, and connection. Speaking authentically transforms the individual and influences the collective. It strengthens identity, fosters resilience, nurtures relationships, and cultivates understanding. The process is neither instantaneous nor flawless, but its effects compound over time. Each honest word, each courageous expression, each thoughtful dialogue contributes to a life lived with integrity and purpose. The silence of the past gave way to the power of presence, and in that transformation I found not only my voice but my freedom.